Good morning, everyone. This is Jim DiAugustino here. We're going to give folks about just another minute here before we go ahead and get started. All right, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time today, and for those who are on the call right now, we will go ahead and get started. Again, good morning. I am Jim DiAugustino. I'm the Center Director for TDO, and I'm very happy to be presenting and hosting this webinar, not presenting, but hosting this webinar today with our friends at ComTec Solutions. And just to touch on a couple logistics before I get into a couple of my own slides here, I did want to point out that today's session is being recorded. So for anybody who joins late or if regardless, when you join, but if you'd like a copy, I'm certainly happy to pass that along. And as we go through today's webinar, we're going to utilize the chat function in WebEx here for any questions. And you can actually send the questions directly to me through the chat window. And I'll make sure that we address those when we finish with the material today. We're going to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. But again, as we go through, just send the questions through the chat window to me, and I'll make sure that we cover those at the end. We'll have plenty of time for that. All right. So TDO, I just wanted to give everyone just a little background on TDO, who we are, what is TDO for the local folks, and then I want to talk about across the state, because I realize we have some folks across the state in other regions as well, and kind of touch on who your local resources are similar to TDO after. So the TDO team here, myself and I have two senior project managers and a business development manager that work for me here. Very strong on the engineering side, Lean Six Sigma side. We do all the lean manufacturing, practitioner type deliveries and offerings there. Like I said, heavy on the engineering side. We also do quality management and food safety consulting work. We offer all the TWI, training within industry offerings, including Toyota Kata. And we also do a lot of maintenance, TPM, and supply chain management support. What you don't see on there is the IT software side, which is where our friends at ComTec come in. We have a very large partner network as well, and we're happy to, clients with those partners in our network as well. So TDO, we're a part of what's called the New York Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program. The acronym there, it's a mouthful, is MEP. TDO, us here, we're a not-for-profit advising organization that was founded in 1988. We're actually one of 11 MEP centers that are located throughout New York State. And that goes to the comment I made earlier. We have, the 5-county central New York region that we cover in our territory, Cayuga, Cortland, Madison, Onondaga, and Oswego. But there are other regional MEP centers all across New York State that cover every single county. So if your county is not listed there, you're welcome to reach out to me, or maybe you already know who your MEP center is. There are a lot of those same support services that I touched on the previous slide that the other MEP centers across the state can also provide. And we're part of, a national network. Every single state has an MEP presence. Then again, every single state is structured a little differently than New York State, but nonetheless, our mission is to help small to mid-sized manufacturers and those tech companies grow. I mean, that's really the mission at the end of the day there. And all MEP centers are measured on the impacts that they're able to deliver to clients. And those are done via surveys. Things like new and retained sales, jobs, cost savings, and new investments. Those are the things that all MEP centers are measured on. And, as far as, funding as well, the work that the MEPs do, and also some of those third-party costs, that go into things like ERP consulting. There are some funds out there. So I'd encourage you, again, please get in touch with your local MEP. And I'm more than happy to direct you to the right one if you're not sure who your MEP is, because there's a lot of good to be had from that relationship, a lot of good connections, and like I said, even potentially funding. So that's all I have, short and sweet. I just wanted to give everyone, just a brief overview of who TDO is, but also, really inform you about the MEP system as well, if you didn't already know. So at this point, I'm going to be turning over the presentation to our friends at ComTec. As I mentioned earlier, ComTec, they're one of our partners. They offer a lot of awesome services that, we don't offer, within the MEP network. And, as I mentioned, we're very, very happy to connect with folks like ComTec to ultimately deliver that value and deliver those services to clients to help them grow. So I'm happy to pass it over now to Rob and the team at ComTec.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for joining the webinar today. I'm sure many of you feel like I do, that we've been on an awful lot of webinars over the past 2 months, but we were happy to move this from an in-person event to a webinar to still share the message and share the information that we're trying to share. So I just wanted to start off by reminding everybody the kind of the agenda that we sent out when we sent the invite out, and talk about who should attend the event. If you are a manufacturer that's looking to upgrade your system, or deciding on what's the right way to look for a system, and talk about some of the differences in options. Those are the people that we are hoping that are on the call and looking to get something out of the webinar today. And just a quick plug to Jim and his team. We have many clients that have used the MEPs, both out in that area as well as in the Rochester, Buffalo area and other areas, and even out in our Connecticut area to help implement process improvement type systems, and it works very well for them. So it's a great option out there to help. So the agenda we've got today, and the team that we've got on the call from ComTec, myself, Rob Moyer, I'm the president and owner of ComTec. We've got Dan DeJoy, who's in our business development area, and we've got Alyssa Salcedo, who is our marketing manager. We're going to cover really 4 topics. We're going to talk about best practices for ERP selection. What should you focus on when you're going through this process? How to ensure a successful project, and really just some tips and tricks from what we've seen over the years, and then talk a little bit about deployment options. Everybody wants to talk about cloud versus on-prem, so we just wanted to kind of hit on that a little bit and show you some options. So I've got one brief slide about ComTec. So So we've been around for about 25 years. We are located in Rochester, New York. We have a second office just outside of Hartford, Connecticut. We actually came from the manufacturing side. I worked for a manufacturer that actually runs our product 25 years ago, and decided to start this crazy business. And there's two sides of the business. One is certainly we sell and implement a tier 2 application for ERP. And then we also have the IT managed services side, where we support and manage your infrastructure. So with that said, let's get right into some of the best practices for how we look at ERP selection. And again, we're coming at this really from a publisher agnostic side, and saying, what should you be looking at when you're looking at how to find a good ERP system. And one of the things that we like to point out right out of the gate is, some of the negative, right? We all see it in the press. You can see the source here is Panorama Consulting at the bottom there. We realize that as people put in systems, they sometimes they don't get really the benefit they're looking for in that implementation. Oftentimes, out of the gate, we're looking and saying, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do the other. And then we get into reality, and it just doesn't happen. And there's reasons why it doesn't happen, and those are some of the things that we're going to be really talking about today. The other one we like to point out is, some of the projects, don't even go live, which is obviously nobody wants to buy what I call shelfware. You're purchasing an ERP system and then never get it over the finish line. Budget is always a concern. There's oftentimes budget overruns, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and how to kind of prevent that and keep an eye on it. And then, why do they take so long? And so there's ways to kind of minimize that timeline, and then there's ways that really allow that timeline to get extended. I often tell a story about a prospect who became a customer that purchased our system and told me he was going to have it implemented in 60 days. And I told him he was crazy. He actually had a team in place ready to go, and he proved me wrong. That's not to say that's the norm. That's just to say that anything is possible, but there's certainly things we can put in place to prevent those types of overruns. And then lastly, it's really kind of eye-opening to see the number of companies that look at an ERP implementation, and they're really looking at features and clicks and buttons versus business process improvement. And that's one of the things we really want to focus on today is, should we be looking at features and function, or should we be looking at business outcomes and process improvements? So we all look at this ERP selection lifecycle. We've all been part of it, or maybe you haven't been part of it and you're starting down that journey. So you go through the selection process, and what we're hoping to promote with people, especially today on the call, is the ability to change this life cycle, because we get into the process of selecting the ERP system, and then all of a sudden we have a change in our business. Obviously we've all seen change in the last couple of months, but maybe it's more longer term change. Maybe you're a manufacturer, then you decide to do some distribution, or maybe you've now got a field service requirement or something like that. So you have a change in your environment, and you need to be able to address it within your system. Next thing you know, you're implementing a bunch of workarounds. You put in manual processes, you put in spreadsheets to handle the different systems outside your ERP system. And then you start to have this gap start to develop between your ERP system and reality. And you've got these outside systems, you've got 2 or 3 systems. Next thing you know, you really don't have a single version of the truth. And now you're back to square one again. Now you're saying, well, listen, I implemented this system. I've run it for 5 or 6 years. We've got changes in the business. Now we need to start over. I can tell you personally, I was involved in a life cycle like this. It was a 2-year life cycle where I had selected the wrong system when I worked for the local manufacturing company back in the day. And it's not a good feeling when you realize that you've just done that loop and you're back at the beginning. And so we really try to make sure that prospects and customers understand that, you know what, that's really, there's ways to prevent that. One of the things is you have to make sure that you've got a system that's flexible, that allows you to grow, allows you to change, and not get kind of looped into this cycle. So when we look at a selection process, many people will do it differently. This is what we really put together and say, when we start a selection project, and we do consider it a project, this is what it looks like. Start to finish, this selection process, it could take a month. It could take 3 months. We've had them take, I don't want to say we've had them take years, but we've had them take years over the course where you're halfway through a selection process and all of a sudden there's an acquisition or a change of ownership, and you start over, but sometimes they take longer than anybody likes. But we treat it like a project, and we want to make sure that these steps are followed as we go through. So we have dates and milestones for each of these steps. We want to have that initial meeting and really understand if there's a match between your organization and our organization. Make sure there's a match for the software. If you're not a good fit, then really a software vendor will want to walk away. They're not going to want to get involved if there's not a good fit. Once you establish that, then you're going to want to come in and do a discovery and do a deep dive with each area in the business and see, what your requirements are, what your business challenges are, so that we can kind of get ready to prepare what we're going to show you and show you the right items. Then we put together, once that discovery happens, then we're going to put together a timeline with the key milestones, like this document here that says, we've got dates, we've got times, we've got, who's responsible for what, and we're going to track it and make sure that we hit all of these dates. We want to make sure that the milestones are hit and the prospect is meeting their goals as they go through this selection process. We want to sit down and look at what we heard. So now we move into the summary of findings and say, we think we understand your business. This is what we think we heard. Did we actually hear those items? Any corrections that you want to see and hear? And really what we're looking for here is when we go to demo the system, are we going to hit on the major points that you want to see in that demo? Once we get through that, we move into the demo. And when we do that demo, we're not looking to show you how to do a cash receipt or how to do a journal entry. I hate to use the word assumption, but the assumption has to be there that if we're a tier 2 application, we can do those things. What we're really looking for is what's different and unique about your business. What business challenges do you have, and how are we going to solve them? And that's what we're looking to do. Then we move into the design process. After we've demoed the system, we're designing a solution. We're reviewing that solution with you, moving into a kind of an executive review of the solution, bringing in your ownership, your functional and financial team to make sure that they're on board with the documents, and then going through the review and signing. So that's kind of the start to finish of a selection process or project. And again, from our perspective, our sales team, they're really acting as project managers to make sure that our resources and your resources are staying in line, in tune, and ready to go. All right, so then what am I looking at when I do a selection? So I've got a few notes here when you go through the process. So there's some options as you look at an ERP selection. One is a third-party selection process. You can go out and you can find companies. I know some of the MEPs offer this. I'm not sure if they all do, but they'll go through a third-party selection process where they will help you take your requirements and really normalize those requirements, and then run that process with the different vendors. Now, there's also for-profit companies that do the same thing. The advantages are, it can be an objective process. It's certainly unbiased. Typically, sometimes the cost can be prohibitive, so you really got to look at that. Especially, obviously, the for-profit companies, they can be rather expensive sometimes. I would also say it depends on the strength of your internal team and their ability to run the process versus getting some outside help. And then the only advice I'd give you there is really make sure that that consultant in that third-party selection knows your business. And I've worked with some great ones, and I've worked with some that really aren't so great. And I know I've worked with some of the MAPs that offer this, that you know, they really get in there and they dig in and they know your business, and that's always helpful when you're dealing with that third-party consultant. Then you can run it internally. If you're going to run it internally, there's some things you need to look for there. You need to really make sure that you're consistent across your vendors. You need to focus on your business objectives. Make sure the core team you assemble is tight. You don't want 20 people on your selection committee. That's too many people. It's too many questions. It'll slow the process down. And the fact is, you're just not going to please everyone when you go through that process. But the other thing I point out here is to reach out to your TDO or the local NTMA chapter, maybe Vistage if you're a member of Vistage, or other peer groups, and ask them who are they using for manufacturing. When you're limiting the number of vendors, or when you're looking at the vendors, rather, limit that number. Don't go out and pick 15 vendors and start looking at them. You may want to take a cursory look on the website. When it's time to actually get into demos, get it down to 3 or 4 really good companies that are a good fit, and then move it forward. You're gonna exhaust your users before you even get into the ERP implementation, and that's going to be a challenge. And then I always like to put a plug in for, you know, having a local company. It's not always possible. We do implementations all over the country, and I'd love to tell you I can jump in my car and drive to any of them, but I can't. But if you can find a local partner, not only a short term, having it from a cost perspective be certainly better for your company, but longer term, as you build that relationship and bring on additional functionality and people, it's certainly a nicer fit. And then lastly in this section is, you know, be comfortable with all 3 areas. I always say it's a 3-legged stool: software, publisher, and your partner that's going to implement. And in the interest of time, I'll move through this rather quickly, but from a software perspective, you want to make sure you've got a good fit. You've got a flexible system that's adaptable and will change with you as you grow. And make sure that publisher is really investing in that product. Make sure that software has plenty of R&D dollars behind it. On the publisher side, you've got to be comfortable with the software publisher. Make sure they're a viable company. Look at their support model. Make sure that they're there to back up the partner should you need it. Should that partner go away, you don't want to be left out high and dry. You want to make sure you've got somebody to back them up. And make sure you have access to the executives at the company. No ERP company should be so big that you can't pick up the phone and call an executive if you need them. And then lastly, the partner organization, like a ComTec or another partner, make sure that they've got a well thought out implementation plan. Make sure that they're using a proven methodology. Make sure that they've got the industry expertise behind them, that they're a viable company. And then, you know, look at their bench strength. See, you know, what they've got in the back to back them up while they're doing that implementation. That's really around the implementation, or I should say the selection process. And then quickly, I wanted to hit a couple topics on, you know, what should your focus be during that selection. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to move through this rather quickly. But what we talk about here is the ability to really look and say, you know, where is that change going to be? And it can't be feature function. You really have to look and say, is there productivity and operational improvements that I'm going to get from this system? You've got to have a business reason to move into a new ERP system. It's an investment in your company. You've got to, of course, improve somehow your customer experience. And then, of course, we say you're positioned for growth. So if you can really justify that to the business owner, to the leaders in the business, then you've got a case to go ahead and say, yeah, we're going to go ahead and look at this system. But if it's just feature function based, if it's just time, that's really not a justification to look for a new ERP system. So Epicor went out, and this is actually pre-COVID. There I said the word pre-COVID. They went out and talked to their manufacturing customer advisory board and asked them what was important to them. So they met with the CAB, and they sat down and they said, these really 7 areas are what are important to our businesses, in an ERP system or in, moving this ball forward. And what you'll notice here, it doesn't talk about feature function. It doesn't talk about, I need the ability to do accounts payable or accounts receivable. That's just an assumption. But what many customers said is we really need to increase throughput. We need to do more with less. We need to do better on the quality side. We need to make sure that we're retaining and attracting talent. So Epicor looked at that and said, well, okay, that helps us figure out what the next steps are as they went through, through their development cycle. So one of the things we try to point out to people with this slide is it's again, look at how you can improve your process, how you can automate your process, really not the feature function side. So then we looked at some of the other business objectives that they had, and it was clear that they wanted to automate. So anything that you can do to set up electronic workflows and approvals and automated communication, very helpful within the organization. They also wanted to provide a tool that's easy to use, allows their new employees to get up to speed quickly, gives access to training at their fingertips. They also wanted a system that was intuitive and easy to use. They wanted visibility into their jobs, into their profitability. They don't want to dig for information. They want to just have access to it at their fingertips. They wanted the ability to scale their organization. That's always important. So again, not talking about features and function, but really what business drivers do you have in your organization? And then lastly, the growth. So we're always talking about growing our companies, and that's really where you have to look at it and say, is this thing going to be here in 10 years and allow me to grow where I need to get to? So I put a couple sample slides in here just to show you what we look at when we, this actually came from a customer of ours, maybe, 6 months ago or so, where they had a need and we needed to solve it. So we looked and tried to focus on what challenges the business had, what problems and goals they were solving for, and why the business should invest in an ERP system. And again, this comes from that that process of sitting down and going through a discovery and saying, what problems are we solving? And then we turn around and said, okay, well then here's the future state. So we're focusing on, where are we going in the future? What items, what does it look like on the other side of this implementation? Whether it's, something like, the reduction of the paper-based process or cost reduction or process standardization. We really wanted to look and say, here's the before, here's the after, and this is why we're doing this project. So now you've gone through the selection process, you've picked the software that you think is the right system for your company, and now you want to look and say, well, how are we going to make sure that this is a successful project? So one of the things that we, again, start out right out of the gate, we talk about some of the challenges. Some of the challenges in implementing an ERP system. We all have heard the stories, we've seen the articles, and again, this is just some of you can read through, I'm not going to read them to you. But one of the things a couple of things that we talk about when we look at this is we want to make sure that we're following a structured methodology, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. You want to make sure you understand your goals and objectives and make sure that they align to the company. We want to take very close attention to the human element because that tends to be where we see some challenges, and we'll hit on that in a moment. And then actively manage the risk. There is inherent risk in an ERP implementation. As long as we know that going in and we know that it's not going to all be roses and sunshine, we have ways of mitigating that risk as much as possible. So this is where we talk about where is the change management, where is the need for change management, and typically what we see is it's around people. It's not typically process and technology. Usually it's your people, it's your users saying, I want the system to do exactly what it used to do. I want the screens to look like the same. I want the fields to be the same. And that's a challenge. And we've had implementations ourselves. I can distinctly remember one from about 10 years ago where I finally got a call set up with the owner of the company and said, listen, your employees want exactly what the system that they're getting rid of. They want our system to look like it, feel like it, and do. And ultimately, he gave the okay and said, yeah, I'm okay with that, and spent twice the budget of the implementation. And I was scratching my head at that time, and I scratched my head 10 years later. They're still a customer. They still run on our system, but they spent an awful lot of money making the system look like the old system. We would prefer them to look at it and say, no, let's look at the new way of doing business, the new objectives, and make sure that we're not looking back all the time and really trying to fit the new system into the old. A couple things to remember when you're going through a project like this and trying to manage this particular component. Strong internal and external project management will help you immensely with this change management piece, because this is really important. So this is the methodology that we use, and regardless of you know, what system you go with, what company you go with to implement, make sure they have a proven methodology. We actually make our sales cycle part of our methodology. So that first stage there, that prepare stage, is actually part of our sales cycle. Epicor does that because they want to make sure that we're selling the right software to the right people. But regardless of that, make sure that there is a solid methodology so that people really understand that they've got a repeatable process, that they can stay on time and on budget. And if you've got this process in place, it'll help you in the long run. So just a few things about this. So when you go through the methodology, make sure you're going through a proper planning stage before you ever move anywhere forward. Make sure you've got a good project plan. Make sure when you get into the design stage that you go through and develop your business procedures, and really make sure that you're following a process like this to make sure that the implementation is successful. The other thing to consider when you're making sure that you've got a successful implementation, remember that this is a major undertaking for your company. If you've got other competing major projects in your company, you know, year end, obviously, we all know year end happens and you just have to work around it. But things like construction projects, we've seen them all. We've had customers that have been acquired during implementation. We've had them do an acquisition. We've had them, you know, you name it, we've seen them do it. Just remember that as you're going through this process, this is going to drain your resources from your organization. So if you've got 2 or 3 of these projects going on at the same time, that's setting yourself up for failure. So sometimes you have to put it on pause, but make sure that you've got the right resources dedicated to it. Then we talk about your team. So when you set up a team, and when we talk about a core team, which is, you know, generally somewhere in the neighborhood of less than 10 people for most organizations, when you set up that core team, make sure they've got the right qualities. Excuse me. Make sure that they're change leaders. Make sure that they've got the right mindset going into this project. Make sure that they're doing a very good job documenting and communicating with the team, both internally and externally. Make sure you've got the right mindset around engaging your employees. So get other people involved during the process as needed. Making sure that you're monitoring your progress, and then identifying issues, gaps, and risks. So make sure that their responsibility is clearly defined during that process, and make sure that they're identifying issues, that they're testing the system properly. So make sure you set the expectations on that team, get the right team in place, and then set the right expectations that will help you be successful in that implementation. Then we talk about the demand of time on the team. Nobody likes to see this slide. A little bit of an eye chart, but the point here behind this slide is that your core team is going to have some dedicated time on this project. We typically say a couple of days a week. Now, we have customers that will come in and say, we don't have time to spend 2 days a week for, this core team, 5, 6, 7 people. Well, that's fine. You just have to plan that into your project timeline. So if you plan on working 1 day a week on it, it'll extend your timeline. If you plan on working 3 days a week, it'll decrease your timeline. So you really just have to be realistic about the expectations and make sure that that your plan accommodates that. The other thing we like to remind you is that you need to make sure you've got backups. So if one of your core team members goes out sick or decides to leave the company or something like that, how are you going to manage the risk on that and make sure that you don't skip a beat when that person leaves or is unavailable during the implementation? So we sat down several years ago now with our team and said, you know what, we've had some implementations that have gone beautifully, and then we've had some implementations that make you pull your hair out. What's the difference? What should we be looking for? How can we flag the ones that need a little extra care and attention? And this is the list we came up with, and as Jim said, he'll be sharing this presentation, so you'll have this list. But a few I like to hit on: make sure your executives are involved right from the beginning. Make sure you've got the right support from them, the involvement. You've got to have that level of dedication in your organization. We already talked about project management. Make sure you've got the strong internal project management. External project management, of course, it's almost a given, because if you're hiring somebody to do a job like this, you expect it. But internally, make sure you've got the right person in place for that project management. Sufficient resources, we talk about often. We talked about it on the last slide. This is going to take time from your team, and you need to make sure you've got the right resources. Small to mid-sized businesses, we all deal with the same thing. We all deal with the fact that we're wearing multiple hats, and we want to make sure that we've got the right team and ready to go. Make sure you're doing a lot of simulations and piloting. Make sure that you're testing that system over and over and over again. 1, 2, 3, 4 tests is not good. 20, 30 tests when you're starting to run through the transactions. Really make sure that you're trying to break the system. And then lastly, the use of tracking tools. Make sure that you're tracking any issues and all issues that you have in the system during that implementation, so that everybody's on the same page and make sure that they get resolved. So a couple things to remind your team as you're going through this implementation. Be visionary. Make sure they understand that change is good. Look at new rules. Look at new ways of doing things. They need to be realistic, and really everybody needs to be realistic. The management team needs to be realistic. You gotta understand what needs to be done here and how it's going to get done in your organization. And I always tease my customers after they start moving ahead with us. I never said this was going to be easy. It's hard work, but when you get on the other side of it, there's certainly a lot of benefits, as we all know. So let's talk about deployment options. So there's a couple of different options you can look at, and we just kind of wanted to hit on them briefly and get you thinking about the right choices. So we all know that the cloud is there. We're using it. I would say that we are probably all of us using some form or shape of a cloud-based application every day. We may not all be in the cloud and all of our applications be in the cloud. Some of the industry experts probably 5 years ago now were saying, you know what, in 5 years, everything is going to be in the cloud, all the manufacturing applications, all the ERP systems. It just didn't happen. I would say manufacturers weren't ready for it. I would say a lot of other industries weren't ready for it. There were some limitations that people weren't really looking at the time. And just not everybody has fully adopted the cloud strategy. And that's fine. But one of the things that I like to point out is, regardless of what direction you do go in, make sure you have a choice. Make sure, if you are implementing an ERP system, that you can choose. If I go to on-premises today and I want to move to a cloud strategy in 2 years, make sure they've got an option to move you to cloud, and vice versa. If you go to cloud and in 2 years or a year, you have a business case to say, hey, you know what, we need to move back to on-prem, you need to have that option. You don't want to be going through this process again in 3 years. So just make sure you have choice as you go through that, and realize that you know, cloud is not the only way, and we'll talk about that as we go through this. So I think I'm not going to really focus on this too much. I think we all know the value of being in the cloud, but a few things to think about. If you do have internal IT people, you can certainly use them for more process improvement and better options than managing a server. It certainly helps you to stay current with your software if you're in the cloud. Security, we all know, is a big concern. Well, security in the cloud is a concern, but guess what? So is security in your on-premises environment. So you need to look at it from both perspectives and say, well, geez, if I have $1 billion company managing my security on my ERP system versus my internal or outsourced IT, there may be something to look at there and realize that there's some benefits to being out there. Certainly, you know, helps you to scale. If you were to go from, you know, 10 users to 20 users to 50 users, let's say you did an acquisition and you decided you need another 50 users, it's a matter of turning up a switch and you're off and running. So there are some definite benefits of going to the cloud. So there are other options. So we talk about really three. There's the cloud deployment option. There's the on-premises where you purchase the software and install it in a server in your environment. And then there's a hybrid option where you can purchase the software and install it in a cloud environment, in a private cloud. So you can put it in a data center. You can install the software. You still have some of the advantages of being on premises. But you've got some of the advantages of being on a cloud as well. So I kind of put a grid together here to show, you know, what you have with each option as far as, you know, do you have control over the upgrades, you know, your security, your ownership, internet access. So there's some different things that you can look at, but just remember there are actually three choices in most cases. Where you can go to a full cloud enabled, you can go to a full on-premises, or you can go to a hybrid model. And then I always remind people that, you know, cloud is not for everyone. There are certain industries. If you're in med device and there's some mandates about taking updates every month or every 3 weeks, there may be some things you need to look at there. If you've got reason to have direct access to your database, typically you're not going to get that in a full cloud model. If you've got a ton of software customizations that you're planning to do, it may not be a good fit for you. There are some legal reasons why you wouldn't possibly be a good fit. And then also just if there's other reasons, if you have a requirement that you need to be in a private cloud for some reason, then the public cloud is probably not the right option for you. So just make sure you've got that choice, and it's something that really you should be digging in with that vendor to make sure what your options are. And then lastly, I know nobody cares about cost, but of course we all care about cost. So look at a TCO calculator and really look and say, where is my break even? I will tell you, we typically see it's around 3 to 5 years is the break even point. So it's the whole, you know, leasing versus buying a car. Everybody's got an opinion. You just need to look at it, make sense of it. Just remember that when you are doing that comparison, there are some soft costs that you're really not necessarily seeing. We talk about the cost of hardware. We talk about the cost of software and maintaining servers and power and cooling. And so there are some things there that you need to look at. You know, after a certain number of years, that server's got to be replaced. So you need to add that into your full calculation. Things like, you know, your software operating system, antivirus, backups, updates, you know, all those things that you really need to add into that total cost. But there's a bunch of calculators out there that you can find, or you can certainly do it yourself and really look at that comparison between cloud and on-prem. So that's what I've got. What questions do we have out there?
No questions actually came in during the presentation, but we're at a point where if anyone has any that they'd like to open up and talk about now, you're welcome to take yourself off mute and ask away. Your material was apparently very thorough, Rob.
I guess so. Well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Jim, and I'm going to hand the ball back to you.
All right, sounds good. So yeah, I mean, if there's no questions at all, then we can certainly go ahead and wrap up today's session. Rob, I really appreciate the material. Nice job there, and I hope it was very informative for everyone else on the line. As I mentioned earlier, ERP is not necessarily an expertise of the MEP network in terms of the software side, but there are a lot of things that your local MEP can help you with. Doing some of that analysis on the front end, figuring out some of those inputs, critical inputs that need to go into that decision making process. So MEP certainly can help that process. And as I mentioned earlier, your local MEP, in terms of funding, can also help point you in the right direction there and let you know what, if anything, is available to help. So again, a lot of opportunity there to connect on the MEP side. But overall, again, Rob, thank you very much for presenting today. And again, I hope it was very informative for everyone. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. All right. Take care.